Hi guys, a rather quick one for you today. I saw this question from Mr. Eccles, who is a Valorant professional on Twitter. And in answering the question, I started to realize there's actually two premises here that, if you understand them, is very helpful. And I think it's two premises that actually I think hurts a lot of people by not understanding them in their aim training journey. And so I wanted to cover it in this video. So firstly, I want to talk about the cycles of aim training. And secondly, I want to talk about the sort of unconscious and conscious relationship that we have with aiming performance, because we need to understand that too. And if we can understand all of these elements, it starts to help us better define, okay, I'm in this stage of what I'm trying to do with my aim. So that means like I min max and I optimize in these ways because I understand more fundamentally like where I am, like what the process I'm trying to execute is, like why I'm trying to execute this process, what my brain is actually doing, how I should use my energy and focus to support what my brain is actually doing, as opposed to just being like sitting down and being like, okay, I'm just going to grind some aim trainers and play loads of DMs and then I'm jumping in the match. Because of course, that can work, and that's, over time that's going to help you get some improvements. But I'm always about min-maxing stuff and trying to really, really be as efficient as possible. So first things first, understanding the cycles of aim training through the lens of the 4 stages of competency. So we've got our 4 stages of competency. And we start at the bottom of this, where we are in unconscious incompetence. So we are not conscious as to how much we suck, but we definitely suck. And so obviously, it's not a good place to be in, but it really is the bottom. That's where you start. And then as you become aware of how much you suck, you're starting to see that you're missing shots, and you start to understand that, okay, I feel like my mechanics or my aim is sort of not on par with the level I'm trying to play at. I'm now aware that this is a problem. And now I can be a bit more aware. I can ask some questions. Well, what kind of problem do I have with aim? So you're starting to ask the questions. There's a problem. So now you're consciously aware of your incompetence, and you do the analytical phase where you're trying to figure out, okay, what is the problem? Okay, now I understand the problem. What are the solutions to that address that problem, that go with that problem? And that's the process you're undergoing. And so then the next process that you undertake is, okay, well, now I'm going to execute the solution. Now I've decided what that solution is. So over time, you've been executing this solution. You're doing your aim training, or you're focusing on things in DM or whatever it might be, and you're improving your technique and your skill. And over time, now you're starting to become consciously competent. So you're having to apply the changes that you're making consciously. It's a conscious effort that you need to do this, either in your aim training or either in your matches, but it's happening. And then eventually we get to the very, very top of the pyramid, which is unconscious competence. And this is now your new normal. This is your new default. You've replaced successfully the old habits with the new ones, the old technique with the improved and new technique. And so that's kind of the cycle that we're operating in. But I would, again, posit that it's a little bit more complicated than that, because we need to understand how aiming works in our brains effectively. And we can, I'm going to use that sounds kind of intimidating to say that, because our brains are vastly complex. And I always found it funny how, of all the things in the universe, it's like one of the things we understand the least, yet we all carry it, just in our heads. But that aside, aiming operates like many other systems in the brain. I think breathing is actually fairly analogous, and I will go into why. So we have an unconscious and a conscious element with breathing. So we generally, most of the time, we are doing it automatically without any conscious control. We're not trying to do it. And when we're asleep, we're just breathing, hopefully. And when we are awake, most of the time, we are just breathing unconsciously as we're doing other things. But it's not a system that you have to consciously control. Now, there will be times when you will try to consciously control this system and you will consciously take it over. And that might be for varying purposes. Maybe it's because you've become very physiologically activated, and the adrenaline and all these different things like cortisol and noradrenaline are all rushing through your system. And you're like, okay, holy fuck. Okay, I've got to calm myself down because my breathing rate and everything, my heart rate's going up like crazy. I'm going to take control and just right the ship here. Or it could be the case that you're doing meditation or something. And I think this is particularly interesting, because in meditation, one of the reasons why we have a lot of focus on breathing is because we're trying to do a couple things. One, we're trying to essentially focus our awareness and attention onto one specific thing. And so this is why you also have body scanning as a thing that you do in meditation, where, okay, I'm going to kind of bring my awareness, my conscious awareness into my leg and feel what my leg feels and how does it feel, like what's the temperature, like is there like weight on it, all these different things. And what's interesting about this is that a large part of why this is relaxing is because it's stopping you from being able to focus on it and or giving attention to intrusive thoughts, your racing mind, like these varying things. Now, the reason why this is particularly interesting in terms of, and why it's analogous, in my opinion, for performance sports and specifically with aiming, is because when we have problems with aiming, what tends to happen in game, our brains tend to think, oh, this is a problem. I'm going to try to consciously take control of this system. Now, what we understand is, or at least my personal experience and what I understand, is that aiming is done at its highest level as a completely unconscious, mechanic. That it's all of our experience of our habit, of our like well-trained habits, that's just being executed. And this is very much when when people in sports talk about falling back on your fundamentals. In my opinion, this is another way of explaining that your fundamentals are the ingrained habits that you have trained with hours and hours and hours of diligent, high quality practice, so that these systems are really high quality. And so when you're just executing, all the systems that are secondary in nature or more unconscious in nature, like aiming, in my opinion, generally should be when you're performing, are just like really high quality and second nature. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is because, as I mentioned, there are examples when it is beneficial to us to take over control of our breathing system so that we can, have certain outcomes. Now, similarly with aiming, it's also important to consciously take control of our aim in specific scenarios. We don't perform the best with that, but it is very useful because what we're trying to do when we are trying to improve our aim is we're trying to create new habits. And to create new habits, we oftentimes need to kind of deconstruct the habit that we have and pick out the things that we want to improve. Because aiming, let's say flicking or tracking or whatever it is usually going to be a multitude of different techniques that are all kind of applied together. So what we want to do when we're often doing, aim training, we're trying to isolate our different aspects of our technique so we can improve them and gain edges. So what we want to be doing then is, by consciously taking control, when we're trying to make a flick shot in an aim trainer, we're like, okay, I'm going to be really focused on clean lines. That's what I'm trying to achieve right now. And so you just get repetition, high quality repetition on getting clean lines. And although your overall performance will be worse because you're consciously controlling the system, you're trying to create these new pathways, you're trying to create these new habits and behaviors by consciously taking over. And then over time, by working on the lines, working on the micros, working on attention management, like whatever it is that you need to kind of begin to improve, you start to either notice, more problems because you're able to see, okay, is there a struggle here? Is there not? So you can kind of keep, working on it consciously, or it's going to be the case that over time it actually starts to really take shape and it improves. And then you add all of these small improvements together, and then you get to a spot where, okay, now I'm combining all of these techniques, all of these things together, mushing them all together. And then once you're at that stage, you're thinking more about, okay, I need to just learn and execute all of these things together. So you're trying to now shift away from the conscious execution, and you want to transition that conscious execution of the new techniques into the unconscious. And like I said, the high degree of repetition really helps this. But there is this sense, generally speaking, when you're going from conscious competence to unconscious competence, that kind of transition requires some level of conscious execution, but you're trying to, of course, reduce it as much as possible, so that because eventually you're replacing the habit and it needs to be unconscious and second nature. And so this to me is the many phases of aim training, because we start somewhere. We then end up with improved technique, but to get there, we have to have an understanding of when we're consciously executing, when we're consciously taking control of the system, and when we're not. And this is, so going back to, Eccles' tweet, he was talking about changing sense. And one of my, big pieces of advice to professional players specifically with changing sense is that you need to make sure that you do it in such a manner that you are very used to the sense that you're playing on, or at least, you've locked it in for a few, 2 to 4 weeks. It definitely depends on the individual, but you just need, the outcome is that when you hit your season, you're starting a season, you need to feel very comfortable with the sends. And it's not that you need to feel like you're super insane with the sends, but the sends needs to feel like second nature. And the reason is because you don't want to teach yourself that changing sends is the solution in game, because it firstly is not. Secondly, you also want it to be the case that you are not giving yourself an excuse for your conscious awareness to take over the execution of aiming. You don't want that to happen, because when you're performing, as we mentioned, you just got to hold your hands up. If you've got shitty aiming habits, you have shitty aiming habits. You will play worse if you try to consciously control your aim when you're trying to perform in game. You will play worse. You have worse performance. And the reason, we go back to the breathing analogy, much like with breathing, where we're saying, okay, I'm putting my conscious attention into my breathing for meditation and maybe body scanning, these types of things. Well, that means that your brain is going to be putting less energy and focus and attention and processing power into actually making decisions, into communicating to your teammates, into picking up all of the information, so that you have the ability to make the best reads possible, so that you are as dialed in as possible. As soon as you start to take over your aiming system consciously, now you're going to be a weaker player in terms of all of those other factors. So this is a pitfall that many people fall into, is that they think they can fix their aim, but you can't. And I can't like really emphasize this enough. You cannot fix anything about your aim when you're actually in the match. Whatever you walked into the match with is what you have. And so we need to make sure that that's what we kind of, train ourselves to understand. Because generally speaking, aiming performance, it can be down to so many different things on the day that can be affecting your aiming performance. But because your aiming performance is just like what it actually is, like we've described, is like, think about the stages of competency that I described and how we kind of build our technique. We build it to be habits. We build it to be automatic. So if we're at the point where it's not doing what we want it to do, you can't suddenly improve an automatic system by consciously taking control over it for this purpose. That doesn't make sense. And so I just really want people to let go of the idea that when you enter the game, that you can really do anything about your aim at that point. The places where you can do stuff about your aim, it's more long-term thinking. We need to think more about, okay, well, my day in, day out process is I've got, these days of the week where I'm putting, maybe 20 minutes into some technique work, and I'm doing 10 minutes of like pure warm up. And then I'm doing my playing session. And then maybe at the end of the day, I've got some review or some notes that will inform what I will be focusing on in my future technique sessions. But that's where the aim is improving, is the technique sessions, and then how you try to transition the technique sessions into the DMs that you're playing. That's where your aim is improving or not improving. But you cannot do anything about aim when you're in the match. When you're in the match, if you're not hitting shots, don't get pissed off at your aim. Instead, double down on focusing on how to solve problems in the game. If you're having confidence problems, understand that winning fights, although it might give you some extra bits of confidence and help you feel better about your aim, in reality, thinking like that is already a red flag, because what you're going to start doing now is you're going to make decisions oriented around taking fights and your confidence, not oriented around winning the rounds for your team or responding the best way to the opponent's strategy, or responding the best way to what your team is experiencing and solving problems as a team. Instead, what you're doing is actually very self-centered in this very negative sense, in that you're trying to capture your own confidence and at the same time making strategic decisions that are poor. So I hope that this is like a good way to help you guys understand exactly where you might be putting that conscious focus, what it's good for, where it's not good, and how it all kind of feeds into the overall process of the 4 stages of competency. So the last thing that I'll say to kind of cap off the video is that, a question that many people may have with regards to all of this is that, hey, pros don't understand a lot of these ideas or have a lot of these processes, and they got really good. And I would say to that's true. That's completely true. But I will also say that this is one reason why we have a lot of resistance from the pro community, because they got to that level by just doing their own thing. And in many cases, doing their own thing just means playing a shit ton. And the thing is that works. It definitely works. But that only works for a certain population in the playing demographic. And the reason why it works for a certain population is because they are talented or gifted. But what does that mean? That probably means that they have an affinity for, improving at certain things. Like, for example, it is often the case that people that can get good at stuff naturally, they can get good at lots of shit. There are specific people that are really good at getting good at one specific thing, and that's because of their ability to analyze and break down that thing. But that might not, it might not be innate to them to have generally great approaches for improving in general. Their ability is more specific. People are very different, and a lot of players will be naturally focusing on the right things that a lot of other players won't have the sense to do. And for some players, they'll be naturally focusing on the right things just instinctively. Like, it's just natural and obvious to them. And that's really what makes them talented in many respects. But there are lots of pro players that will kind of only get so far. They'll get stuck in certain places. Their mechanics will get stuck, or their decision making will get stuck, and they'll run into walls. And the thing is that's where coaching is really beneficial, obviously, because a coach's job is to understand all of the things. And then they don't want to burden players with that understanding that they have. That, I'm talking about all of these different concepts like aiming is breathing and 4 stages of competency. They don't need to know any of that. What the players need to know is what they need to do and how they need to do it. That's all they really need to know. So when you have a good coach is going to understand not just the theory, but how it actually works to integrate the theory into practices that the players can do, that the coaches can guide them through, that helps them to solve the problem. That's really how that's supposed to work. So when I'm saying all of this stuff and there is that question out there of, well, pros don't need to know these things. That is largely true, but a lot of my content has always been about understanding how all of this stuff works, because there is a large population of players that do actually want that information, because they might be people that are able to be talented in other ways, and they might need a bit of a boost in this area and understanding where to focus or how to think about certain things. So I don't know, I'm starting to do like what I feel like are lectures, but if this is helpful, let me know. It feels like, this stuff is pretty niche, but honestly, if it helps a few people, I think that's really, really awesome. So with that said, stay tuned as well, because I think today's Thursday. So tomorrow I'll be dropping the video where I'll be talking about just an aim training challenge for my community. So if that's something that you want to take part in, make sure that you check that video out. Again, it should be going up tomorrow. Well, it will be going up tomorrow at some point. So, all right. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.